Be'ezus Hashem, today's daf is Masechta Bava Basra Daf Chof Gimel. And we'll start from the Mishnah, but I'll just give you a picture of what we're discussing over here. I'm not sure, but in ancient times, people used to raise doves in a dove coat. And this is how it looks, as you can see on your screen. Maybe they had it as a pet, or for some religious reasons, people had this thing on their property. And our mission is discussing when you have something like this on your property, how much do you have to distance it from your neighbor? Very important, because you don't want to have something on your property that causes damage to your neighbor. And just like in where we live, you can't build a pool right up to your neighbor's house, obviously, because you could damage his foundation. So there has to be distances and limits of what you can build next to your neighbor's property. So that's what the Mishnah is discussing on Daf Chav Gimel Amud Aleph by the Mishnah. Says the Mishnah, Marchikin es hashoivach. You have to. Hi, Steve. We just began. Daf Chav Gimel. We're discussing this picture over here, the shoivach, which is the dove coat. So the Mishnah says, Marchikin es a shoivach. If you have a shoivach, a dove coat, where you raise doves, you min ha'ir, you have to be far away from the city. If you're going to raise it far away from the city, not next to anybody's house, and there has to be a distance of chamishim amma, 50 amas. Why 50 amas? Well, it's understandable because a dove can fly and it can start picking up the seeds of your neighbor's garden. So therefore, you have to you have to distance a shoivach, a dovecoat, from him 50 amas. Then the Mishnah says, let's say you have a field, right? And you have just an open field. So you just put up a dovecoat. You have to not make the shoivach in your field. If you have 50 amas for all the fields that you're surrounding. Okay, the first part of the Mishnah is talking about putting up a shoivach in your backyard. So therefore, obviously, unless you live in a very rural place, you're highly unlikely you're allowed to build a shoivach in your backyard. So you have to, if you're going to build one, you have to be living at the end of the city and then distance it 50 amas. The second part of the Mishnah is saying that
how long is 50 amas? How far away is 50 amas?
100 feet, 100 feet.
Okay.
Problem is that I don't know why people would raise this in ancient times, maybe as a pet or something like that, because these birds right over here will start picking up the seeds of your neighbor's little garden, and can do damage. So you have to protect yourself from damaging your neighbor's property. So if you're going to raise some doves, you have to distance it from his property at least 50 amas. And if you have a field, and you have an open field, you're not living there. So make sure that if you're setting up a shoivach, a dovecoat, it has to be a distance of 50 amas to your neighbor on each side. Rabbi Yehuda is more stricter. He says base abba skurin. You have to distance it 275 amas, which is a much bigger distance. The maloi shegeri hayoina, because that's the amount a yoina could fly. That's the amount that a yonik can fly, and therefore, if a bird will fly, it can fly to somebody else's property very easily. That's Rabbi Yehuda's situation, and we're going to see why the Chachamim disagree with that in a moment. Vim lakchay. Let's say you bought a piece of property, and you bought a house, and it's in this city, and the guy has a shoivach in his backyard. Lucky you, he has a dovecoat. So we can assume that he made peace with his neighbors, and the neighbors are okay with it. So afilu base roiva, even if there's a small distance between the dovecoat and the next door neighbor, harehu b'chaskasa, you're allowed to keep it. Now that's very odd, because sometimes you bought a property from John Gotti, right? So when he put a shoivach in his backyard, nobody said anything. Nobody wanted to start up with him. But who says that when you purchase it, you have the right to maintain that shoivach? So we'll see more about that in the Gemara. Says the Gemara, Chamishim Amma V'sulai, you told me that a bird, a dove, can fly only 50 amas, and that's it. And then it goes back to its dove. Then it goes back to its home. Says the Gemara, Minu, I'll ask you a contradiction. Ein person neshavim liyonim, elam came rochak min hayishuv shloshim ris. You're not allowed to spread a net to catch a dove only if it's away from the place where people are living 30 ris. That's an enormous amount of distance. Why? Because if you place your bird's nets to catch a dove very close to the city, perhaps you're catching a dove belonging to somebody else. So you're trying to catch, dove from the wild. So therefore, you have to distance it from the Yishuv 30 ris, which is much more than 50 amas. And so how does our Mishnah say? The Mishnah seems to understand that the maximum distance a dove will fly from its dove coat will be 50 amas, 100 feet. Not true. Birds will fly much further than that. So the Gemara answers, and this is the point. Steve, I think you touched on it. Of course, a bird, Amar Abai explained, a bird will fly large distances. But within the first 50 amas, it takes the seeds and fills up its belly. And therefore, it's not hungry anymore. So the first 50 amas is where the birds will search for food. Beyond 50 amas, okay, it'll fly as much as it wants to fly for freedom. So therefore you distance the first 50 amas. That's why the Chacham hold you distance 50 amas between you and your neighbor. So the Gemara now says, okay, so what is the maximum that a dove will fly? So the Gemara says, so the Brisa says, a dove would fly shloishim ris. Shloishim ris v'sulai. Does a dove fly 30 ris and that's it? For Tanya, we learned in a Brisa, uvayishuv, if you're dealing with an inhabited place, afila mea mil lo yifras, even if it's 100 miles from this, let's say you have a village, a circle village, even 100 miles away, you should not spread a net, because the bird probably will travel 100 miles from that village to the net, and that dove belongs to somebody else. You see, a dove doesn't have a siman on it, but that doesn't give you a right to take somebody else's dove. So we see that a dove will fly, according to the Brisa, 100 miles. Answers the Gemara. Rav Yosef Amar, Rav Yosef explained that Brisa is very different than the Mishnah that says ris. B'yishev kramim. That's talking about where there is a place where there's vineyards, where the bird can really take a rest and go further, and rest and go further. There's a lot of vineyards there. So therefore, even 100 there, you have to distance 100 miles from the place where people live, because they're surrounded by kramim, that village, the bird can potentially fly longer distances. Rav Amar says it doesn't necessarily mean that the village was surrounded by kramim. It could be surrounded by yishes shayvachim. It's surrounded by other bird coops, so it's other dovecotes. So therefore you have to distance. If it's surrounded by dovecotes, then you have to be 100 mil from the village itself, because the bird will fly from the village to the dovecote, and then can fly, if there's a dovecote all the way 100 miles, it will fly 100 miles. Says the Gemara, what am I concerned about the bird from the city? Those dovecotes indicate that they belong to somebody. And so maybe the bird, even if you're going to put the net there, the bird came from the most distant dovecote. It really doesn't belong to. So why do you make a whole spiel that you're concerned about? Maybe from the city, this bird is going to come. The bird came from the most closest shayvachim, most closest dovecote to where you placed a trap. Answers the Gemara, could be that those dovecotes surrounding the city belong to him. Or maybe those dovecotes belong to a guy. Or they're just hefker dovecotes. So you're not concerned about the dove coming from those dovecotes surrounding the village. You're concerned about the dove coming from the village itself. And therefore, if there's a way for the bird to travel 100 miles from the village via landing on other dovecotes that don't belong to anybody, so then you can't set your trap even 100 miles from the city. You have to go a little further to make sure that you're catching nobody's dovecoat. Rabbi Yehuda said, Beis Abbas Kurim. And the Mishnah said that if you bought very interesting, the Mishnah said that if you bought, let's say, a house, in the backyard, there was a dovecoat, and it's not distance 50 amas from the neighbor, we assume that you're allowed to keep it there because the previous owner made peace with the neighbor. Amar Papa v'Temer Rav Zvid Zois Emeris, that the Mishnah says this, To'anin l'lekeach v'to'anin l'yorish. We see a concept called that we will, the Beis Din, the court will defend a purchaser and will defend an inheritor. For example, the Mishnah says that if you are living on a property for 3 years and nobody said anything, and then somebody walks in and says, "Oh, that property belonged to me, and I have proof." So even if you lived there for more than 3 years, you have to answer that lawsuit. Maybe you lived on somebody else's property wrongly. But if you purchased the property or you inherited the property, and somebody comes and says, "Wait a second, you just purchased this property. You know that the guy that sold it to you, it didn't belong to him. It belonged to me. I have witnesses that this field belonged to me, or you inherited this field from your father. I have witnesses that your father that didn't belong to your father. It belongs to my father. It belonged to me." So then, for a purchaser and for a inheritor, Beis Din automatically has a defense for them and says, Beis Din says that even if we will say that no, that since we know for a fact that the father or the seller lived there for 3 years, it's automatically assumed to belong to him, and therefore the purchaser gets full rights to it, or the inheritor gets full rights to that. Okay, so that's the Mishnah says. So we see the Mishnah says that idea. You purchase something with a dovecoat in it. Let's say, what would happen if the neighbor says, "Hey, I don't want that dovecoat anymore. It's too bad." Since you're a purchaser, the courts will defend you. And the purchaser, the guy who wants to complain about the dovecoat in the backyard, can't say, "Oh, I didn't want to say anything to the old owner, but to you, the new owner, I'm going to say something." No. You're allowed to maintain status quo and keep that dovecoat in the backyard, even if it's not a distance of 50 amas from your neighbor. And that's the chiddush of the Mishnah. Says the Gemara, Yorish Tanina. What did Rav Papa said? Rav Papa said in the name of Rav Zvid that for even inheritor, courts will defend it. Wait a second. We have the same idea. That's another Mishnah. Haba mishum Yerusha ein tzarich taina. Somebody comes from an inheritance. He doesn't have to say to the guy back, it says, "Oh, you sold it to my father and I inherited it." All he has to say is, "My father lived here for 3 years and nobody said anything, so I'm keeping this." So the courts will accept that and will defend the inheritor. So that's an open Mishnah. I don't need Rav Zvid to teach you that. Answers the Gemara, Lekeach Itzrichle. Rav Zvid had to say that the same defense applies also by a purchaser. Says the Gemara, Lekeach Nami Tanina. By a purchaser, we also have a Mishnah that if you purchase something with something wrong with it, but you get to keep it because you purchased it, and we'll defend you if somebody complains. For example, Loka Chotzer, you bought a courtyard. Let's say it has cross beams in that come out of your courtyard and stick into the Rishus Harabim, and now people have to go around it. It's like something blocking the Rishus Harabim. But you bought it that way, right? Harezo bechaskasa, you get to keep that rights, right? It's grandfathered in. And so we see that we defend purchasers, right? We always grandfather the rights of the purchaser if no lawsuit occurred beforehand. Nobody complained beforehand. So why does Rav Zvid has to say that for a lekeach, we defend the lekeach, a purchaser? That's also a Mishnah. And why do we need this Mishnah? Answers the Gemara, tzricha. If it would just say the idea where the complainer would be the Rishus Harabim, Hasam gabe Rishus Harabim, ema kindness like shleihu, inama echuli achle b'nei Rishus Harabim gabe. Maybe you can say by the Rishus Harabim, we let him keep that right to stick his beams into the Rosh Hashanah, because maybe he originally was brought it into himself, right? It's mostly in his property, or the Rosh Hashanah got used to it and they forgave him for it. But if you're dealing, maybe the guy, the guy living around the dovecote will say, I didn't want to say anything to the old owner because I was scared of him. But you, I'm not scared of. That's why I'm opening up my mouth now. So therefore, I would say no. Then we wouldn't let the lekech keep that right. So we wouldn't say the novelty of our Mishnah. Yashmin hachab, if we would say the case over here, the chivin the yachid ema pesui paisa for a yachid. When we're dealing with a dovecote over here, we could say the old owner for sure must have made up with the neighbors. Otherwise, they wouldn't have allowed him to keep it there. Or he paid them, or they let him have it. But when you're dealing with something going into Rosh Hashanah, man payis, man shavik, who allowed the original owner, who appeased the original owner, who had the permission to accept money, or who wrote the permit for him to keep these things protruding into Rosh Hashanah. So I would think that the purchaser of that property should not have to keep that right. Tzricha, that's why the Chiddush on the Mishnah. And lots of times you see that in real life, that sometimes you have something that's not following the code anymore, but it's grandfathered in, based because of the purchase, because of the way you bought it, or the old owner, did something illegal, and you're allowed to keep it. That you see often. Once you have something, wait a second. We have another statement from Rav Nachman, who said that if you have something that could potentially damage somebody else, there's no chazaka. You have no right to keep it just because you had it all the years. If it's damaging somebody else, you can't. You have to take it down. And our Mishnah says that if you have a dovecote, you're allowed to keep it there. And says the Gemara, Rav Mari Amei Bekutra. Rav Mari said that Rav Nachman was talking about smoke. If you're smoking into somebody's house. You're doing something, let's say you have a bakery and it's smoking into somebody else's property. Or you have a toilet that's so close and the stench reaches somebody else's house. So it's hard to imagine permission was ever granted, right? By a dovecote, maybe the other guy was a friendly neighbor and pet friendly, and therefore he allowed the person to put the dovecote even close up to his property. But here, Rav Nachman said, what Rav Nachman is talking about, if you have such a clear and present something that could damage somebody else's property, you can't imagine that the purchaser could keep that right, because it's hard to imagine that the original owner made up with his neighbors that he was allowed to do it, because it does so much damage, like smoke or stench. Okay, new Mishnah on the second page. Says the Mishnah, Nipol. Now this Mishnah really doesn't belong here; it belongs in Eilu Mitzias, but we're talking about birds over here. Let's say Nipol, you found a baby bird. That's it's found within 50 amas of this bird coat. So let's get one up, right? You find a bird there. Hareisha Balashavich belongs to that owner of that dovecote. If it comes outside 50 amas, the guy who finds it is allowed to keep it. Nimtza bein shayva. If you find it between two dovecotes, so you don't know which dove it comes from. The karav lezeh, if it's near this one, shalai. Karav lezeh, shalai. If it's near that dovecote, it belongs to them. Mechzel mechza, it's on the 50-yard line. It's right in between. You don't know if it came from the left dovecote or the right dovecote. Shneim yachloiku, then they split it. They sell it and they split the money. Again, it's hard to imagine, but these dovecotes were real property belonging to people, but it was hard to put a siman that it belonged to you. The only siman is that you have a dovecote, and probably that's where the bird lived. So that made it yours. Amar Rab Chanina. Rab Chanina said, the Gemara begins, Roiv v'karev. If you have a choice to decide, let's say, if something's kosher or not, right? Let's say you want to decide if something's kosher. And Roiv tells you it's kosher. But let's say Roiv tells you it's not kosher. The karev, but it's close to a kosher butcher store, right? It's close to a kosher butcher store, but most of the other butcher stores are not kosher, and you have a piece of meat. Holchim achar roiv, then you go after the majority. Now, the concept of deciding a quandary, a doubt. So the Torah tells you, Deruba Daraisa. The Torah tells you, Achri Rabban Lahatis. Try to go after the majority, right? Statistical significance matters. So if it's a high percentage, you can decide in that direction. But Bekurva Daraisa, the Torah also tells you that if it's near something, the Torah tells you by an Egla Arufa, if you want to, which city brings the Egla Arufa, because the murderer probably came from there, you have to, wherever the dead body was found, closer to that city, most probably the murderer came from there. Even though there was another city with hundreds of murderers there, the murderer came from where the dead body was closest to the city that it was found. So therefore, Ruba, going after Roiv is the Raisa. Going after something nearby is also the Raisa. Ruba Adif. Nevertheless, you decide matters going after the majority because majority is a more stronger decision factor. Masav Rab Zera. So Rab Zera asked a question against Rab Chanina. It says, the city that was closest to the dead body, that brings the Egla Arufa. So, Va'afa Gav, says the Gemara, the Ikach Rita Nefishimene. What the Torah is telling you, that even if there's a city right near, that right a further distance away from the dead body, but there's much more people living in that city. And you have a small little town, village over here, which the dead body was found near that village. That village brings the Egla Rufa. But if you're going to look where the murderer statistically would have came from, it maybe would have came from the city that has more people in it. And yet the Torah decides this case by going after the Karev, the one that was nearby. And says the Gemara, Bidaleka. That's very interesting. Our Mishnah is talking about, let's say, a town that was in the middle of a mountain. No other town is nearby. Therefore, if it's close to that town brings the Egla Ruva, and it's not deciding Karev versus Rive. It's just Karev over there. Says the Gemara, Veleza Basa Deruba Dalma. Okay, you don't know who the murderer is, but you have the entire world that's full of people. So probably the murderer could most likely came from another part of the world and not over there. Answers the Gemara, B'Yosheves Bein HaHarim, that we're talking about that it's a very isolated mountainous area. You never think of the Chumash discussing a Egla Rufa in that case, but imagine deep in Nepal where there's a village there and there's no other city in sight. There, the din Egla Rufa applies. But again, if there was if there was multi-city around it, then perhaps the Egla Ruva would not be decided by where the dead body was closest to. Let's do another 2 more minutes. Now we learned in a Mishnah. Nipel hanimtza b'soicha bishamama harei hu shel bal hashayva. Again, our Mishnah. This is how this came in. You found a little baby bird that's found within 50 amas of the bird dovecote. So who does it belong to? The guy that owns the dovecote. Va'afagav the ika achrina the nafesh mnei. Maybe in let's say in a little further distance, there's a big dovecote with much more doves in it. No, you say we deciding the factor. You have Korev and Roiv. You decided since it's closer to the dovecote within 50 amas of that dovecote, we'll give it to that dovecote owner. Wait a second, but maybe it comes from another dovecote where the guy had much more doves in there. And so how do you decide it? Our Mishnah decided so easily that it belongs to the one that's near the 50 Amma. Answers the Gemara B'Daleika. Our Mishnah is talking about there is no other dovecote around. Okay, so the choice is either it belongs to the owner of that dovecote or it landed from somewhere else, and it's a free bird. So therefore, since it's within 50 amas of that dovecote, then we give it to that dovecote owner. Ihachi, says the Gemara, if that's what you're talking about, that there's only one dovecote around there, Ema Seifa, Chutz Mechemishim Amma, Harehu Shel Moitze. If it's beyond 50 amas, then the guy who finds it can keep it. V'ida Leika Vadem Ehudinafal. If there's no other dovecotes around, why should I say that it flew from heaven? It probably fell from this dovecote, which is, maybe more than 150 amas away, but that's the only dove cote where doves are living. So this dove flew a little bit over 50 amas. So how can we say that the guy who finds it beyond 50 amas, he's allowed to keep it? If there's no other dove cote around, he should give it back to the dove cote owner that's there. Answers the Gemara, and here the Gemara just retracts on everything. It says, so here the Gemara retracts on everything. It says, here we're talking about bimidada, that we're talking about a dove that can't fly yet. So therefore, really, what we're trying to say is a whole Mishnah is talking about doves that cannot fly. They just move around, they're baby birds. So therefore, if it's within 50 amas, it belongs to the nearest dove cote owner. Even though there's much more, there's a dove cote owner who has tons of dove further away, but it couldn't, but if they wouldn't have either get to this location, because we're talking about the dove cote raise baby birds that don't fly yet, so they don't go further than 50 amas. So therefore, if it's within 50 amas of that dove cote, then we can sure it came from there. But if it's a baby bird that's beyond 50 amas, then it's the one that found it. Now, how did it get here? So since it couldn't have come from that dove cote because it wouldn't have flown, it doesn't fly. So it probably some bird dropped it from Shemayim. If a bird is just learning how to walk and fly, it will not move around more than 50 amas. And there we're going to end off with one point. Boy, Rabbi Yirmiyah said, okay, at the 50-yard line, 50 amas, within 50 amas, it belongs to the owner of the dove cote. Beyond 50 amas, it belongs to the finder. Let's say you had the bird who can't walk, right? It's just learning, that can't fly, but it walks. Raglei achas b'soich nun ama, v'raglei achas chutz mishmama. 1 foot is within 50 amas, 1 foot outside 50 amas. Mahu, who could keep it? So this is a very weird type of question. If you find it at the 50 amas, 1 foot within, 1 foot outside the 50 amas, can you keep it? So this was asked by Rabbi Yirmiyah. Rabbi Yirmiyah asked this question. For asking such a question, they removed Rabbi Yirmiyah from the Beis Medrash because he's asking such a non-common question. So I don't know why, but you have to ask within something of possibility to be welcomed into the Beis Medrash. Anyway, we'll stop over here. A good Shabbos, everybody.